William Butler Yeats was one of the most influential poets of the 20th century. However, he had an interest in mysticism and the occult throughout his life, and it became very prevalent within his later poetry, and in particular in his book, A Vision. In this video essay, I will be analysing how Yeats' book A Vision impacted his later poetry. I'll be focusing primarily on Sailing to Byzantium, Byzantium, and the Second Coming. To start off, I'll talk about the Second Coming. The Second Coming has the clearest references to a vision. It's in this poem where we find a vivid description of an age ending in its Gaia form, and the subsequent entrance of an antithetical age. The Gaia form shows the start and end of the Christian era. It starts with a falconer at the bottom of the spiral who represents the birth of Christ. The spiral's progression correlates directly to the spreading of Christianity throughout Europe. However, the hawk is at the top of the spiral where Christianity has reached its peak, and where the era will ultimately end with the Gaia collapsing. This entire poem revolves around the idea of the second coming of Christ. However, it emphasizes that we're entering into an antithetical age, where the world will experience the opposite of what it had previously. The Sphinx has a gaze that is blank and pitiless, and represents the coming of the Antichrist. The Sphinx is both human and lion, whereas Christ was both God and human. It's pitiless and, unlike Christ, has no empathy. Another interesting yet grotesque parallel is the appearance of vultures during the Second Coming. When Christ was born, there's an appearance of doves, which are pure and seen as good. Whereas we have the opposite here, we have scavengers that tend to circle and consume death. Next up, we'll be looking at Sailing to Byzantium. Sailing to Byzantium is a poem that focuses primarily on the anxieties of old age and Yeats' search for spiritual meaning throughout life and art. The city of Byzantium was very briefly a city where religion, practicality, and the aesthetic were in balance. Yeats himself said this about his Byzantium poems in a BBC interview in 1931. "I have been writing about the state of my soul. When Irishmen were illuminating the Book of Kells and making jeweled croziers, Byzantium was the centre of European civilization, so I symbolised the search for spiritual life by a journey to that city." We can see themes of transcendence and the afterlife in this poem, which has direct links to a vision. When Yeats was revising this book, he spent most of his time focusing on his theory of death and the afterlife. He broke it down into 6 primary stages: the meditation, the return, the shiftings, beatitude, the purification, and the foreknowledge. He describes death as an equivalent to an awaking at sunrise, and the regaining of a solar consciousness with the clarity of knowledge. The way that Yeats describes his journey to Byzantium ultimately mirrors this. He has sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium, where he can reach the epitome of his knowledge. The separation of the spirit and celestial body are clearly referenced within this poem. As he writes, "Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form as any natural thing," implying that rather than returning to earth as a human or a living being, he wants to remain as a spiritual energy. Lastly, I'll be looking at Byzantium. Byzantium is the sister poem to Sailing to Byzantium. It responds in a similar way to Blake's poem collection, Songs of Innocence and Experience. This poem primarily focuses on the phases of the afterlife and the body passing, but the spirit becoming something spatial and continuing to exist. At the beginning of this poem, we can see Hagia Sophia, and it's the evening. Yeats uses this as he considers dusk to be a transitional time. He's in the twilight of his years, a transitional zone. In the revised version of A Vision, Yeats states, "Death which comes when the spirit Gaia is at Aries is symbolized as spring or dawn, and birth which comes when the spirit Gaia is at Libra is as autumn as sunset." In terms of Byzantium, we could approach dusk as a symbol that he's being reborn into the antithetical era of his life. The crossover to another space or era doesn't necessarily imply death, but in relation to a vision, it could symbolize a new beginning or a period of time. Yeats attempts to describe this in the poem, but the imagery is difficult and strange. The metaphor behind this complexity implies that it's impossible to describe something that cannot be seen or experienced by a living human. Everything about this poem is influenced by his theories on the afterlife, and showing the contrast between the natural world and the afterlife. He encounters a shade as someone who may have already crossed the threshold and entered the afterlife. The shade is described as shade more than man, more image than shade. The shade appears to be in a mummy cloth bound by Hades' bobbin. This image correlates to the idea of spiritual shedding. The webpage Yeats Vision explains this in a very clear way. Like the Theosophists, Yeats views the process of the afterlife as one of progressive shedding. Firstly, the faculties and the husk, then of the passionate body, until the spirit and celestial body are briefly united. The shade is quite possibly one of the exceptional cases that Yeats describes. He implies that it is only in exceptional cases that the faculties or lunar principles continue to exist more than a short while after death, which is why this shade is still visible to the narrator. In the poem, the moon becomes a symbol of change. The quote, "by the moon embittered," is a reference to Yeats' analysis of how life can actually relate to the moon cycles. The year's summer months correspond to the month's primary half of the dark moon, and this day is solar. and all of these represent the discarnate part of existence, between death and birth. Incarnate life, which we might naturally think of as the brighter part of the cycle, is however when the spirit is less apparent, and so is symbolized by the winter months of the year, the antithetical half of the bright moon, and the lunar nocturnal half of the day. The next reference to a vision can be found within the quote, "At midnight on the emperor's pavement flit, flames that no faggot feeds, nor steel has lit, nor storm disturbs, flames begotten of flame." There is a conventional analysis where the flames are the flames of purgatory that purify and burn away all sins, similarly to the flames found in Dante's Purgatory. This conventional reading isn't too far from the symbol of fire in a vision. It is known as the fourth quarter, and it entails the recognition of the external objective reality, which is both nature and God, since for Yeats, God, or the sphere, is the totality of all that exists, and all that is beyond the individual. Yeats describes the element as the most spiritually aware, as with elemental fire, all things are made simple. It is worth noticing the main three symbols in this poem, the first one being, dolphins are a symbol for life in the human body. The second one, the gong is a symbol for the afterlife and a changing time. The final image, the sea is a symbol for the sea of life. The final image in this poem combines these three symbols in order to prove that a desire for life and the afterlife cannot coexist, and that you have to have one or the other. Dolphins are linked to life and are flesh and blood creatures that are carrying the souls to Byzantium. This procession of dolphins to Byzantium is never ending. We can see this from the quote, "That dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea." This is a reference to the theory of incarnation that Yeats has included in the vision. These cycles are never ending, and you continue to live out life over and over, constantly going through various incarnations to gain knowledge. Yeats summed up incarnation by saying, "The most remote consequence of the most trivial acts of the living, provided those consequences are a part of its future life." This implies that your past lives, even the most minute action, influences your future lives, even if it's something that you may not consider. In conclusion, a vision heavily influenced Yeats' later work and provided him with various images and symbols. The image of the gyre is prevalent in a large number of his poems, and he drew upon symbols and theories of the afterlife quite frequently.